translated by Donald Rayfield. Chapter Field Rations. When the four of us had reached the Tuscania spring, we were so pleased that we almost stopped talking to one another. We were afraid that our journey had been a mistake or a joke on somebody's part, that we would be sent back to the stone pit faces of the mines, so ominous, flooded with water from melting ice. Our prison-issue rubber boots were no protection for our feet, which suffered frostbite again and again. We had been following the tracks left by tractors, like the footprints of some prehistoric animal. Then the tractor path ended, and we walked on a footpath that was hard to make out, until we reached a small log cabin with two windows and a door that hung from a hinge made from a car tire and fixed with nails. The little door had an enormous wooden handle, like the handles on restaurant doors in big cities. Inside the cabin were bare bunks made of whole floorboards, and a big, soot-covered tin can lay on the earth floor. Many cans of the same sort, yellow with rust, were scattered around the moss-covered cabin. This was the mining prospector's hut where nobody had lived for many a year. We had to stay here and cut a clearing, for which we had brought axes and saws. This was the first time we had been handed out field rations. I had the standard bag of grain, sugar, dried fish, and edible fats. The bag was tied at various places with odd ends of rope, just like sausages. There was sugar and two sorts of grain, barley and millet. Sav had exactly the same bag, while Ivan Ivanovich had two whole bags, which had been made with crude masculine stitches. The fourth man in our group, Fedya Chapov, had foolishly filled the pockets of his pea jacket with pearl barley and tied granulated sugar in his foot bindings. Fedya used the pocket he had torn out of his jacket as a tobacco pouch, in which he carefully put away any cigarette ends he found. Rations meant to last 10 days looked intimidating. We were reluctant to think that all this had to be divided into 30 parts if we were to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or 20 parts if we were to eat twice a day. We had taken 2 days' supply of bread, because a guard would be bringing more. It was unthinkable to let even the smallest group of workmen go without a guard. We weren't interested in who he might be. We were told that we had to reach somewhere for him to stay before he came. We were all sick of the barracks food. We could have wept every time we saw the big zinc cauldrons of soup being carried on long poles into the barracks. We were ready to weep from fear that the soup was thin gruel. And when by some miracle the soup was thick, we couldn't believe it and were so joyful that we ate it as slowly as we could. But even thick soup in a warmed-up stomach left us with a nagging pain, so long had we been starving. Any human feelings, love, friendship, envy, charity, mercy, ambition, decency, had vanished along with the flesh we had lost during our prolonged starvation. The minuscule layer of muscle that was still left on our bones, and which allowed us to eat, move, breathe, even saw beams, fill barrows with spadefuls of stone and sand, even push a barrow up an endless wooden ramp in a gold mine, had only enough room for resentful anger, the most lasting of human feelings. Sav and I decided to eat our food separately. Cooking is a special sort of pleasure for prisoners. It gives you a satisfaction beyond compare to cook your own food with your own hands and eat it, even if you cook worse than a professional. Our culinary knowledge was minimal, and we didn't know enough even to make a basic soup or porridge. Nevertheless, Sav and I collected and cleaned tin cans, heated them over a campfire, soaked and boiled various things, learning from each other. Ivan Ivanovich and Fedya mixed up their food. Fedya carefully turned out his pockets, checked every seam, and used his dirty broken fingernail to scrape out the grains. All four of us were well prepared for a journey into the future, to heaven, if not on earth. We knew what science dictated as the minimum nutritional requirements, and we knew our tables for comparing the value of different foodstuffs, which showed that 10 liters of water had the same caloric value as 100 grams of meat. We had learned to be meek, we had forgotten how to be astonished. We had no pride, no self-esteem or self-respect, while jealousy or passion seemed to us to be something only Martians might feel and, in any case, was nonsense. It was far more important to learn the skills needed to button up your trousers in sub-zero winter temperatures. Grown men would weep when they found they could not do that. We realized that death was no worse than life and we were afraid of neither. We were enthralled to total indifference. We knew we could put a stop to this life tomorrow, if we wanted, and sometimes we decided to do so, but every time we were stopped by some trivial thing that was part of life. Either we were going to get a box, a bonus kilogram of bread, today, and it would be simply stupid to end such a day by committing suicide. Or the orderly in the next barracks would have promised to repay an old debt by giving us a cigarette that evening. We understood that even the worst sort of life is made up of alternating joy and grief, good luck and bad, and there was no point fearing that the bad luck would outweigh the good. We were disciplined and obedient to authority. We realized that truth and lies were twin sisters, and that truth on earth came in thousands of different forms. We considered ourselves to be almost saintly, thinking that we must have expiated all our sins by the years spent in the camps. We had learned to understand people, to foresee their actions and guess what they were up to. Above all, we understood that our knowledge of people was of no use to us in everyday life. What was the point of my understanding, feeling, guessing, foreseeing another person's actions? All the same, I couldn't alter my behavior toward someone, I wouldn't inform on another prisoner like myself, whatever he might be up to. I wasn't going to try and get the foreman's job, even though it gave you a chance of staying alive, for the worst thing in the camps was forcing another person, a prisoner like yourself, to bow to your will, or anyone else's. What did it matter that I knew that Ivanov was a swine, that Petrov was a spy and Zaslavsky a false witness? The impossibility of exploiting the usual types of weapon made us weak compared with some of our neighbors in the camp bunks. We had learned to be satisfied with little and to get pleasure from little things. We also understood an amazing thing: in the eyes of the state and its representatives, a physically strong man is better, and I mean better, more moral, more valuable, than a weak man, a man who is incapable of throwing 25 cubic meters of earth out of a trench in one shift. The strong man is more moral than the weak, he is fulfilling the percentage, that is, he is carrying out his duty to the state and to society and is therefore respected. That is why he is consulted and taken into consideration. invited to discussions and meetings that may have as their topic something quite unconnected with questions of throwing heavy slippery earth out of wet sticky ditches. Thanks to his physical advantages, such a man becomes a moral force in decisions affecting the numerous everyday questions of camp life. But he is a moral force only as long as he has physical strength. Tsar Paul I's aphorism runs, "In Russia the man I am talking to is noble, as long as I am talking to him." And it obtained a surprising new validity in the mines of the far north. In the first months of his life in the mines, Ivan Ivanovich was a model hard worker. Now he's lost his strength and fails to understand why everyone he meets hits him. It doesn't hurt, but he still gets beaten by the orderly, the barber, the supervisor, the barracks chief, the foreman, the guard. Ivan Ivanovich was happy to leave all that behind for the job in the forest. Fedya Shchapov, an adolescent from the Altai, became a goner before anyone else because his body was half child, half adolescent, and it couldn't cope. So Fedya weakened more quickly and lasted about 2 weeks less than the others. He was a widow's only son, and he was convicted of illegally slaughtering sheep. He had slaughtered his only ewe, something forbidden by law. Fedya was given 10 years, and the pace of labor in the mines, quite unlike agricultural work, was too hard for him. Fedya was bewitched by the easygoing life of the gangsters at the mines, but there was something about him that prevented him from mingling with thieves. This healthy peasant element, a natural love of labor, rather than a revulsion toward it, helped him a little. He was the youngest among us and he attached himself straight away to the oldest and most positive, Ivan Ivanovich. Sav had been a student at the Moscow Communications Institute, and I had shared a cell with him in Butyrki prison in Moscow. Shaken by all he had seen, he wrote a letter from his cell, like the true Komsomol member he was, to the leader of the party, since he was sure that the leader was unaware of all this information. His own case was trivial: correspondence with his fiancée, the evidence for agitation, paragraph 10 of Article 58, was merely the letters of 2 people about to be married, so that his organization, paragraph 11 of the same article, consisted of just 2 persons. This was in all seriousness recorded on the interrogation forms. Everyone thought that Sav would be let off with exile, even given the scales of punishment at the time. Shortly after he dispatched the letter on one of the days set aside for prisoners' petitions, Sav was called out into the corridor and told to sign a receipt of a warrant. The chief prosecutor was informing him that he personally would be examining Sav's case. After that, Sav was called out just once, to be handed the special assizes sentence, 10 years in the camps. Once in the camp, Sav very quickly was in a world of his own. He still couldn't understand the ominous punishment he had been dealt. We weren't exactly friends, we just liked recalling Moscow, its streets, its monuments, the Moskva River covered with a mother-of-pearl like oil slick. Leningrad, Kiev, and Odessa don't have such admirers, connoisseurs, and lovers. We were capable of talking endlessly about Moscow. We brought the iron stove we had carried with us into the hut and, although it was summer, stoked it. The dry warm air had an extraordinary, wonderful smell. We all had gotten used to breathing the sour smell of worn clothes and sweat, It was just as well that tears don't smell. On Ivan Ivanovitch's advice, we took off our underwear and buried it overnight in the ground, keeping each shirt and pair of underpants separate and leaving just a corner unburied. This was a folk way of getting rid of lice. In the mines we had no means of fighting them. In fact, by morning the lice had gathered on the shirt corners that were left unburied. The earth, covered by permafrost, nevertheless thawed enough here to let us bury our underwear. Of course, it was the local earth, more stones than soil. But even this frozen stony soil produced thick forests of enormous larches, whose trunks took 3 men to embrace them, so powerful was the life force of the trees, a great and instructive example given to us by nature. We burned the lice by placing our shirts next to a burning coal from a bonfire. Unfortunately, this clever device did not exterminate the vermin, so that same day we spent a lot of time furiously boiling our linen in big tin cans, and this time the disinfection proved effective. Later we discovered the miraculous qualities of the land when we caught mice, crows, seagulls, and squirrels. Any animal meat loses its particular smell if you bury it in the ground before cooking it. We took special care to keep our fire going non-stop, since we had between us only a few matches that Ivan Ivanovitch had hung on to. He had wrapped the valuable matches with extreme care in a piece of canvas and then in rags. Every evening we placed 2 burning coals together so that they would smolder until morning without going out or flaring up. 3 coals would have burned up. Sav and I had known this principle since we were at school, while Ivan Ivanovitch and Fedia had learned it as children at home. In the morning we would blow the coals into life, a yellow flame would flare up, and we would put a nice thick lump of wood on the burning fire. I divided my barley into 10 portions, but found that too frightening. The operation of feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread was probably easier and simpler than a prisoner's division of his 10 days' ration into 30 portions. Rations and ration cards were always for 10 days. In the mainland they'd long given up on 5-day periods, 10-day periods, and non-stop working weeks. But here the decimal system was kept going far more thoroughly. Nobody here considered Sunday to be a day off. Prisoners who got their days off long after our spell as lumberjacks were eventually given 3 days a month at the whim of the local prison bosses, who had the right to designate rainy days in summer or excessively cold days in winter as prisoners' rest days, official days off. I poured all the barley back, being unable to stand this new torment. I asked Ivan Ivanovitch and Feedy to let me go in with them, and handed my rations over to the common kitty. Sav followed my example. All 4 of us in concert took the wise decision to cook twice a day. There certainly wasn't enough food for 3 meals a day. "We'll gather berries and mushrooms," said Ivan Ivanovitch. "We'll catch mice and birds. And for 1 or 2 days out of 10 we'll just eat bread. But if we're going to go without food for a couple of days before we get supplies," said Sav, "how can we stop ourselves eating too much when they do bring something to cook?" We decided to eat twice a day, whatever the consequences, and, if we had to make the soup as thin as we could. After all, nobody here was going to steal anything and we were getting the full norm. We had no drunken cooks or thieving storemen, no greedy overseers or thieves who grabbed the best food for themselves. We had none of the countless bosses who deprived the prisoners of food and clothing, and who were deterred by nothing, for they had no fear and no conscience. We had our full ration of fats in the form of a lump of hydrogenated fat. Our sugar was less than the gold dust I washed out with my pan. The bread was sticky and astringent, since it was produced by the great, inimitable experts at make-weight, who also fed the bosses of the bakeries, the grain in 20 different sorts, millet, kibbled wheat. All that was extremely mysterious, and frightening, too. Fish, which according to some secret scale of values was substituted for meat, came in the form of rust-colored herring and was meant to make up for our increased loss of proteins. Unfortunately, even the full norm was not enough to nourish or satisfy us. We needed 3 or 4 times as much. Our bodies had been starving for a long time. We didn't then understand this simple truth. We trusted the norms, but we didn't know of the familiar cook's observation that it is easier to cook for 20 than for 4. There was only one thing we were perfectly clear about: we didn't have enough to last us. This amazed us more than it scared us. We had to start working. We had to smash a clearing through fallen trees. In the north, trees die lying down, like people. Their enormous bared roots look like the claws of a giant predatory bird caught in a rock. From these gigantic talons, thousands of tiny tentacles, whitish offshoots covered with warm brown bark, stretched down into the permafrost. Each summer the permafrost retreated a little, and a tentacle-like root would then immediately use its fine hairs to pierce and anchor itself in each inch of thawed ground. Larches reach maturity at 300 years, slowly raising their mighty, heavy bodies on weak roots that are spread all over the stony ground. A powerful storm easily fells these weak-kneed trees. Larches would fall on their backs, with their heads in the same direction, and they died lying on a thick soft layer of bright green and bright pink moss. Only the twisted, crooked, low-growing trees, exhausted by constantly turning toward the sun for warmth, stayed obstinately on their own, keeping their distance from one another. They had kept up this intensive struggle for life for so long that their tortured, crushed heartwood was of no use. A short, many-branched trunk, covered all around with terrible growths, like the scarred bark when a branch has been broken off, was unusable for construction, even in the north, where nobody was fussy about the quality of house-building materials. These twisted trees could not even be used for firewood, since their resistance to the axe could exhaust any workman. This is how they avenged themselves on the whole world for the damage the North had done to their life. Our task was to make a clearing, and we boldly set to work. We sought from sunrise to sunset, we felled timber, we cut it into blocks and piled it in stacks. We forgot everything else. We wanted to stay here as long as we could. We feared going back to the gold mines. But the stacks rose too slowly, and by the end of our second day of intensive work it was clear that we had not done enough and that we didn't have the strength to do more. Ivan Ivanovich made a meter-long ruler by measuring out 5 of his handspans on a young 10-year-old larch he had felled. That evening, the guard came, measured our work using a staff with notches, and shook his head. We had done only 10% of the norm. Ivan Ivanovich tried to argue with him and took measurements, but the guard was implacable. He mumbled about face meters and solid bodies, which was way above our heads. One thing was clear: we were going to be put back in the camp precinct. Once again we would go through the gates with their inevitable official, government inscription: labor is a matter of honor, a matter of glory, a matter of valor and heroism. It's said that a quotation from Nietzsche was used over the gates of German concentration camps: to each man his due. By imitating Hitler, Berien outdid him in cynicism. The camp was a place where you were taught to hate physical labor, or labor of any sort. The most privileged group among the camp's population were the professional criminals. Was it for them, perhaps, that labor was heroism and valor? But we weren't afraid. On the contrary, by recognizing how hopeless our work was, how pathetic our physical capabilities were, the guard had brought us unprecedented relief, without upsetting us or frightening us. We went with the stream, and we were drifting to the end, to use the camp terminology. Nothing bothered us anymore. We found living according to somebody else's will easy. We weren't even concerned about staying alive, and if we slept, it was also to obey orders, the camp's daily agenda. The peace of mind achieved by dulling all our feelings was rather like that higher freedom of the barracks that T.E. Lawrence dreamed of, like Tolstoy's non-resistance to evil. Someone else's will was constantly watching over our peace of mind. We had long been fatalists and never gave a thought to our life more than a day ahead. It would have been logical to eat all our food at once and then go back and serve the prescribed sentence in a solitary cell or go out to work at the pit face, but we didn't do that. Any interference with fate or the will of the gods was improper, for it broke the code of camp behavior. The guard left and we stayed on to cut a clearing and make more stacks of wood. Now we did so more calmly, caring less. We no longer quarreled about who had to get under the butt of a beam and who would take the top end when it had to be carried to the stacks, or skidded, to use the forester's term. We took more rests, we paid more attention to the sun, to the forest, to the high pale blue sky. We loafed. One morning Sav and I managed to fell an enormous black larch that had by some miracle survived storms and fires. We threw the saw down on the grass, it rang as it hit a stone, and we sat on the trunk of the tree we had felled. "Right," said Sav, "let's dream a bit. We'll get through this, we'll go back to the mainland. We'll soon get old and we'll be sick old men. We'll get stabbing pains in the heart, or rheumatism will give us no peace, or we'll have chest pains. Everything we are doing now, the way we're spending our youth, sleepless nights, hunger, hard work for long hours, gold mining in icy water, cold in winter, beatings from the guards, all of that will leave its mark on us, even if we stay alive. We'll be sick without knowing why, we'll be groaning and going to outpatient clinics. Work that is beyond our strength will have given us incurable injuries, and in our old age our whole life will be one of pain, various unending physical and mental pains. But these terrible future days will be interspersed with days when we breathe more easily, when we are almost well, and when our sufferings stop bothering us. There won't be many days like that. They will equal in number the number of days we will have managed to loaf while in the camp. How about honest labor? I asked. The only people who call on you to do honest labor are the swine and the people who beat us, cripple us, eat our food, and work living skeletons to death. They believe in that fiction even less than we do. That evening we were sitting around our much-loved stove, while Fedia Shchapov listened attentively to Sav's hoarse voice. Well, I refused to work. They drew up a statement, saying I was dressed right for the season. What does dressed right for the season mean? Asked Fedia. Well, so they don't have to list all the winter things and summer things you're wearing. They can't draw up a statement in winter that you were sent to work with no jacket or no gloves. How many times have you stayed behind when there were no gloves? We weren't allowed to stay behind, Fedia said shyly. The boss made us tramp down the road. Otherwise that would be called stayed behind because improperly dressed. Just what I meant. Go on. Tell us about the metro. And Sav told Fedia about the Moscow metro. Ivan Ivanovich and I also found it interesting to listen to Sav. He knew things that I, though a Muscovite, had never even guessed at. Muslims, Fedia, said Sav, glad to find his brain was still versatile, are called to prayer by a muezzin. Muhammad decided that the voice was the best signal to call people to prayer. Muhammad had tried everything, a trumpet, a drum roll, a bonfire, and rejected them all. 1500 years later, when they tried different signals on the metro, it turned out that whistles, horns, sirens can't catch the train driver's ear as reliably and precisely as the human voice of a platform controller shouting, "Ready!" Fedia gasped with delight. Of all of us, he was the best suited to forest life. Despite his youth, he had more experience than any of us. Fedia could do carpentry. He could make a simple log cabin in the taiga. He knew how to fell a tree and how to use branches to make a strong night shelter. Fedia was a hunter, too. In his home country people learned to use guns when they were children. But cold and hunger made all of Fedia's qualities useless. The earth scorned his knowledge and his skills. Fedia didn't merely envy the townsmen, he bowed down before them, and he could listen endlessly, despite his hunger, to stories about the achievements of technology and urban wonders. Friendship never arises in a state of deprivation or misery. The difficult conditions of life, which writers of fairy tales tell us are a precondition for friendship, are simply not difficult enough. If deprivation or misery ever gave people solidarity and friendship, then the deprivation was not extreme and the misery was not very great. Grief is not acute or deep enough if you can share it with friends. In the deprivation we underwent, all you are aware of is your own mental and physical strength, and you find out the limits of your capacities, your physical endurance, and your moral strength. We all understood that survival was a matter of pure luck. Oddly enough, in my younger days I used to have a saying that I repeated whenever I had bad luck or a failure: well, we're not going to starve to death. Every fiber of my body believed that phrase. And at the age of 30 I found myself in the situation of a man really starving to death, literally fighting over a piece of bread. And all that was before the war. When the four of us gathered at the Duskania Spring, we all knew we weren't there to be friends. We knew that if we survived, We wouldn't care to meet one another. We would find it unpleasant to recall bad things, hunger that drove you mad, steaming out the lice in the pots you cooked dinner in, a constant stream of nonsensical talk around the fire, pointless daydreaming, gastronomical fairy tales, quarrels with each other, lonely dreams, for we all dreamed the same dreams, loaves of rye bread flying over us like fireballs or angels. What makes a man happy is his ability to forget. One's memory is always ready to discard bad things and retain just good things. There was nothing good at the Tuscania spring, nor on the paths any of us had trodden or would tread. We were permanently poisoned by the North, and we realized that. 3 of us had stopped resisting fate, only Ivan Ivanovich went on working with the same tragic devotion as he had before. During one of our cigarette breaks, Sav tried to make Ivan Ivanovich see sense. A cigarette break is the most banal form of rest, even for people who don't smoke, since we hadn't had any tobacco for a year, and yet we still had cigarette breaks. Smokers in the taiga would gather and dry blackcurrant leaves, and there were lengthy discussions, with all the passion that prisoners can muster, about whether bilberry or blackcurrant had the nicer leaves. Connoisseurs considered that neither of them were any good, since your body demands poisonous nicotine, not just smoke, but one couldn't help deceiving one's brain cells with such an easy ploy. For cigarette breaks blackcurrant leaves were fine, since the concept of a rest from work was in the camps far too hateful. It clashed with the basic rules of production morality, rules that were inculcated in the far north. Resting every other hour was a challenge to authority, a crime, but a cigarette break every hour was in order. Here, as in the rest of the North, what actually happened didn't correspond to the rules. Dried blackcurrant leaves were natural camouflage. "Listen, Ivan," said Sav, "I'll tell you something that happened to me. In the KOLYMA camp we used to barrow sand along the second rail track. It was a long way to deliver the sand and our norm was 25 cubic meters. If you didn't make 50% of the norm, you got punishment rations, 300 grams and gruel once a day. If you made the norm, you got a kilo of bread as well as something to cook up, and you had the right to buy another kilo of bread in the shop for cash. People worked in pairs, but the norms were impossible. So we found a way to get around it. One day the 2 of us would both barrow from his pit face and get enough for the norm. We then get 2 kilos of bread and my 300 grams of punishment rations, so each of us gets a kilo and 150 grams. The next day we work together for my norm. What's so bad about that? The main thing was the guard was a softie. He knew, of course. It was even good for him, since people didn't lose their strength so fast and the total production didn't go down. But one of the bosses exposed this trick and that was the end of our good times. "Well, do you want to try that here?" asked Ivan Ivanovich. "No, I don't. We'll just help you. How about yourself?" "We don't care, old pal." "In that case, I don't care either. The sergeant can come as far as I'm concerned." The sergeant, that is the guard, came a few days later. Our worst fears came true. "Well, you've had your rest, it's time you stopped. You've got to let others have your job. "Your work is more like a sanatorium or a relief team," said the guard, joking grimly. "Yes," responded Sav. "First convalescent centers, then the teams, a tag on your ankle, and now sweet dreams." We laughed out of politeness. "When do we have to go back?" "We're off tomorrow." Ivan Ivanovich was calm again. That night he hanged himself from the fork in a tree trunk, 10 yards from the hut. He didn't use any rope. This was the first suicide of that kind I had seen. Sav found him. He saw him from the path and shouted out. The guard ran over but forbade us to remove the body until the investigating team turned up. He hurried us off. Fedya Shchapov and I got ready to go. We were very perturbed, for Ivan Ivanovich had good foot bindings that were still intact. He had bags, a towel, a spare calico vest, from which he had now steamed out the lice, quilted soft boots that had been repaired, and his pea jacket was lying on his bunk. We had a brief discussion and then took all these things for ourselves. Sav did not take part in sharing the dead man's things. He kept walking around Ivan Ivanovich's body. Outside prison, a dead body always and anywhere arouses a repressed interest. It has a magnetic attraction. That is not true in war or in the camps, where death is so banal and feelings are so dull that a dead body holds no interest. But Sav was affected by Ivan Ivanovich's death. It lit up and disturbed some dark corners of his soul and propelled him to make certain decisions. He went into the cabin, took an axe from the corner, and crossed the threshold. The guard, who was sitting on the mound of earth outside, leapt up and drawed something we could not make out. Fedya and I rushed into the yard. Sav went up to the thick short larch beam that we used to saw firewood on. The beam was slashed by saw marks, and its bark had been chopped off. Sav put his left hand on the beam, spread out his fingers and swung the axe. The guard shrieked in a squeaky, penetrating voice. Fedya threw himself at Sav. 4 fingers flew off into the sawdust, and it took time to see them among the branches and wood chips. Scarlet blood gushed from his fingers. Fedya and I ripped up Ivan Ivanovich's shirt, made a tourniquet that we wrapped around Sav's hand and bandaged the wound. The guard took us all back to the camp. Sav was taken to the clinic to be bandaged and then to the criminal investigation section for the start of a case of malicious self-harm. Fedya and I went back to the same tent we had left 2 weeks before with such hopes and expectations of happiness. Our places on the top bunks had been taken by other men, but that did not bother us. It was summer now, and in fact the lower bunks were actually better than the top ones. By the time winter came there would be many, many changes. I went to sleep quickly but woke up in the middle of the night and went to the duty orderly's table. Fedya had made himself comfortable there. He was holding a piece of paper. I read over his shoulder what he had written. "Mom, I'm living well. Mom, I'm dressed right for the season.